Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are going to start our topic on the circulatory system. And in your textbook, this is all combined into chapter 42. To make this a little bit more digestible, we're actually going to split the notes out into two sections. I'm going to take you through the sort of cardiovascular system in the sense of your heart, your blood vessels, the blood itself here in this first part. So we're going to focus more on just circulation. And then in the second part, we'll take a look at the connection to your respiratory system and looking at breathing and how your body actually does the gas exchange. Now, why do I use the circulatory system when we talk about cell transport? Because ultimately, it's all going to come about your passage of gases. How do we diffuse gases from your blood to your lungs back to the opposite direction, and how do we also then diffuse those gases between your cells and your tissues to ensure that we have the proper oxygenation so that your body can actually do cellular respiration. So that's really where this is fitting in. What I will say is this particular section, especially this first part, is going to really be a quick crash course in your circulatory system. I'm going to give you a lot of details just for those of you guys who are really interested in it, want to go into the health field in the future. I want to give you the ability to just be exposed to it. What I will say though, in terms of the actual exam itself, part two that we go over is going to be much more the type of content you'll see in exam questions. But if you know your basic anatomy of your circulatory system, having that connection that we'll focus a little more on here is helpful for the second part. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so first off, we're talking about material exchange, right? And this is the connection to why we're going to talk about this system here. So every organism has to be able to exchange materials with its environment, period. You need nutrients in, you need to get rid of waste products. So when we're looking at that exchange, that means at a cellular level, all of this material has to pass across your cell membrane, across that plasma membrane. And so that means that we have to have an understanding of what kind of materials are capable of going through passive transport. So diffusion, osmosis, or facilitated diffusion, depending on the chemical composition of the materials we're moving. Or is it going to be active transport? Because I need to maintain those concentration gradients in order for the cell to do some sort of cellular work, but that also means that there needs to be the expenditure of energy to keep those gradients in place. So if we're going to talk diffusion, especially with your circulatory system, that is going to be the big one when we focus mostly on the gas exchange, right? The movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across that plasma membrane. So keep in mind that we're talking about diffusion because those molecules are nonpolar. They can pass right through the lipid bilayer, no problem. But the caveat to that is that diffusion is only efficient over really small distances. All right. So that means that organisms had to have evolved ways to ensure that that diffusion process was happening as efficiently as possible in order for them to do the functions that their cells needed to uh, do. So when we're talking unicellular organisms, things like bacteria, for example, they're going to exchange materials directly with their environment. But that's going to come back to that cell surface area to volume ratio that they can't be really big cells because the efficiency of that diffusion breaks down then. So when we look at something like bacteria, they're on the relatively small end of the spectrum. Multicellular organisms then need specialized systems in order to exchange materials with their environment because the direct exchange from cell to the environment really isn't feasible, especially if you're talking about something like a cell in your intestines or a cell in your stomach, right? You're not going to be exchanging material directly with the outside of your body through those cells. So we've got specialized systems in place in order to do that. If we look at some really small, really thin animals, some of them are capable of exchanging material directly with their surrounding environment. At least certain parts of their body are capable of doing that. Um, think of something like frogs, their skin, they are able to do some basic diffusion of oxygen and things like that across their skin. But they can only be so big in order to make that function, and they still have internal material moving systems. They have a circulatory system to keep the materials within their body moving as well. Most animals will have some other uh, fluid-filled circulatory system where they will exchange material just with a certain subset of their body. For us, it's our lungs, our our digestive tract, right? In order to move materials around. So we're going to focus on looking in this first part here, just kind of the evolutionary progression when we look across the animal kingdom, what sort of systems exist and likely where they evolved in complexity, um, on how organisms take care of this diffusion problem, this efficiency issue. So there are a host of different types of circulatory systems out there. When we look at things like the sea urchins, scratch that. When we look at jellyfish, I should say, when we look at cnidarians, flatworms, like our cute little planaria there, right? These guys don't have a true circulatory system. Instead, they have a type of system that not only functions in the distribution of substances throughout their body, which we would typically think of as a circulatory system, but it's also connected to their digestive system. So it's all one piece. So this is where you get the term gastrovascular, right? So vascular we typically associate with veins or vessels, um, and then the gastro being your stomach, right? So they use their system both for digestion and distribution of materials. So when we look at something like our jellyfish here, right, they've got their mouth here in the center, and then they have this radial system that breaks out from there. And so there will be certain currents of material moving through those vessels out into that radial canal on the outside, and that's how they move material. So it's both their movement of gas exchange, but also to move their digestive materials, so waste products in that sense, food, nutrition, the whole nine yards. Now, these guys do have ciliated cells that line those canals, right? And so cilia are those little hair-like projections we see coming off of certain types of cells so that they can move and circulate fluid and keep them moving in a single direction. All right, so they'll all beat in one direction to keep that circulatory flow going throughout their system. And these systems are only 2 cells thick. So really, really thin systems, really thin organisms to be fair here. And so as a result, they can move material pretty quickly. True circulatory systems, unlike those gastrovascular systems, minimize the diffusion distance in animals that have lots of layers. So what we think of as a true circulatory system like us has some general properties. They have to have some sort of circulatory fluid. All right, most of us probably are thinking blood at this point, which is what we see in us. We will see that that's not necessarily the case in every organism. They do have a set of interconnecting vessels. So again, things like veins, arteries, capillaries, hopefully are coming to mind. And then some sort of molecular pump, or excuse me, I should say muscular pump. And you probably know that as your heart. Now, what we think of as our heart, if you know anything about the heart's anatomy, we're going to see there are some differences, some different plans that exist in organisms. But generally, the term heart is appropriate here. So that circulatory system connects those fluids that surround your cells with the organs that are responsible for the gas exchange, the absorption of the nutrients, and then ultimately the disposal of waste. So again, if we think of our body, just because that's probably what's most familiar to you, our circulatory system connects our blood with our heart that pumps, going out to your tissue cells, in your muscles, also in your digestive tract, as well as your lungs. And so that's where we're talking the necessary needing of exchanging nutrients, disposing of waste products, um, and then also ultimately just getting materials to cells that need those materials. Now, your circulatory system can be both opened or closed, and can carry a certain number of circuits. So when we start divvying out the types of systems that we're going to look at here, kind of keep that in mind. Is it open or closed, and how many circuits does it have? That's a good sort of organizational system, organizational hierarchy on how to think about the way that these systems exist. So let's talk open systems. And these exist in things like our insects, our arthropods, and a lot of mollusks. So hopefully you're thinking, okay, these organisms aren't particularly big. And they're not. They can't be. Because what we're going to see is that the efficiency of this system is better than that gastrovascular system, which is just everything in one system. But we're not going to complete the circuit. We're not going to keep it closed. And as a result, that is going to drive down the efficiency. So, okay, what am I talking about here, right? So if I look at our little grasshopper here, he is an example of a open circulatory system plan. And what you see is that he has this anterior vessel that runs along his back. And then they have these little tubular hearts. So rather than having a single heart, they have a couple of different chambered pumps that exist. They're single chambers, all right, and they exist there. And that just keeps the material moving. And then they have these lateral vessels that empty out into their general body cavity. So their sort of blood, quote unquote, ends up bathing the organs directly. So rather than having a sort of wall to wall system where we're exchanging materials across walls, we're just going to dump the blood out there and it's going to go interact with the cells that are lining their intestinal tracts, their stomach, so on and so forth. Um, but if you look, those vessels aren't connected back to each other. They don't complete a loop, meaning that they're open to the rest of their body cavity. Hence why we call it an open circulatory system. So there is no distinction between their blood, so to speak, and their interstitial or what we call your tissue fluid like we see in our body. All right. So we have a distinction between blood and interstitial fluid, meaning the fluid that directly is bathing your cells is one thing and the blood is something different. In these guys, that's not the case. All right. So it's all one thing, it's all mixed up. They have just a general body fluid that we call hemolymph. All right, hemo for that idea of blood, and then lymph, because if you know anything about your system, your cardiovascular system, it is very tightly connected to your lymphatic system. So your lymph nodes, um, your lymphatic vessels, right? And the whole point to your lymphatic system is to take that excess tissue fluid and return it back to your circulatory system and back into circulation. So realistically, at least for our purposes, you can think of that interstitial or tissue fluid like the plasma of your blood, right? And if you know anything about your blood, it's your plasma, which is basically the liquid part, and then you have your what they call formed elements. So your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets. We're talking here that your interstitial or your tissue fluid is essentially excess plasma that leaks out of your capillaries to your cells to keep them moist, to keep them bathed in fluid so they don't dry out. All right. And if we get too much of that leakage happening, then your body uses your lymphatic system to return it to circulation. Okay. In systems that are open like this, they don't have any distinction between that blood or that tissue fluid, hence where the term hemolymph comes from. And so they're just hanging out there. All right. So the heart will pump that hemolymph through those vessels into those sinuses where the materials are exchanged between their actual hemolymph and their cells. So again, it empties out directly to their body cavity. They keep this stuff moving in a circulatory sense, in the sense that they keep a circulation going, they keep fluid moving in the same direction. so that it does eventually end up back in their heart and keep pumping. Closed circulatory systems hopefully make sense that these guys are going to be considerably more efficient. Now I'm keeping all of that fluid, for the most part, cordoned off into a circuit, which means I can maintain a better pressure. Okay, so closed systems include things like your annelids, okay, so things like earthworms, cephalopods, so squids and octopus, and then vertebrates, us, and probably most animals that come to your mind initially off the top of your head. Okay, so something like our little earthworm here, they have actually got a main heart system here, but it's a handful of chambers that pump, and then they've got vessels that surround the rest of their tissue. Okay, so hopefully the distinction between open versus closed makes sense. Either you keep all the fluid in the same circuit, aka a closed system, or you kind of just let it get to the organs and then somehow suck it back in, but there's no complete vessel to complete the circuit. That's your open system. When we look at your closed systems, then now I can start branching off into, well, how many circuits does it have? Okay, so if I'm going to keep all the material within a single circuit, how do I move it around? How do I do the actual exchange? And for here, we're going to focus mostly on the gas exchange. So if I look at something like bony fish, rays, stingrays, sharks, these guys have a single circulation. They have a single circuit because they've got gills. And so you'll take a look at their heart. Okay, they've got an atria, which is the upper chamber, ventricle, which is the bottom. And they will take that deoxygenated blood, which they're showing here in blue, move it through those arteries to their gills. That blood will move across their gills where they'll do what we'll talk later about as a counter exchange, so that the oxygen diffuses in, the carbon dioxide diffuses back out into the water, and then we get the oxygenated blood that will move through their capillaries out into their body tissues. Counter exchange will happen again. We'll drop off the oxygen, pick up the carbon dioxide, move that back to the heart, and the system starts over. Okay. Something I do want to point out while I'm thinking about it here, keep in mind we talk about oxygen-rich versus oxygen-poor blood. Not that it is devoid of oxygen at all, and not that oxygen-rich has no carbon dioxide either. We're just talking about the levels of the gases themselves. When we look at oxygen-rich blood, the level of oxygen is considerably higher. The level of carbon dioxide is considerably lower. So it's rich in oxygen comparatively to the carbon dioxide levels. The reverse would be opposite when we talk about oxygen-poor blood. Carbon dioxide levels are much higher, oxygen levels are much lower, but it doesn't mean that those gases ever come to a level of zero in either system. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, you always have a little carbon dioxide, even in oxygen-rich blood. You always have a little oxygen hanging around in your oxygen-poor blood. Okay, so single circuit, right, leaves the heart, goes to the gills, goes to the body system to drop things off, and then returns back to the heart. We have a double circulation system. Okay, so we've got two parts of our heart, two atria, two ventricles. Okay, so it's going to require a four-chamber heart for any organism that has a double circulation system. And then you have a pulmonary circuit. Okay, and pulmonary is a fancy word for lungs. And then you have a systemic circuit, which goes out to all the rest of your body tissues. So your right side of your heart is always oxygen poor. That's the blood that's returning from your body after it's dropped off its oxygen and picked up excess carbon dioxide. We're going to take that oxygen poor blood then and run it through the pulmonary circuit to do the diffusion of gases. So CO2 leaves, oxygen comes in. We take that oxygen-rich blood back to the left side of your heart, which is always oxygen-rich, and then we pump that out to your body cells, drop off the oxygen, pick up the carbon dioxide, and the system starts again. Okay, so take a look at the difference again. Single circuit goes directly from the gas exchange organ, in this case gills, directly to the body and then to the heart. When I look at a double system, we go from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, then out to the body, and then back to the heart again. This is considerably more efficient in the sense that, once again, I can maintain a much higher blood pressure once I get that blood to those organs, which means that most of these organisms are larger in scale than you would typically see with a single circuit system. And even if they're still large organisms, these guys all live in water. All right, and so their efficiency to be able to get that oxygen in and out um, is mitigated by the fact that they live in that watery environment and get some buoyancy from that, get some ability to kind of just float around because of that. Plus, they've got that oxygen sort of readily available to them, and it's much easier to pull oxygen out of water than it is to pull oxygen out of the air. All right. So moving down to this whole level, right? So we started off at the top. Is it an open system or a closed system? Closed systems then could be a single circuit or a double circuit. We're now going to move down into some hierarchies within that double circulation system and just look at some of the options that exist here for some types of organisms. So here's your fish, right? This is just to give you some idea of what a single circulation system looks like one more time, just in a little more detail. We're going to look at these guys over here that have a double circulation system. So when I look at something like amphibians, um, reptiles, right? Those guys, or excuse me, the amphibians, I should say, they have not only their lungs to send that blood to, but they also have a cutaneous circuit. So remember I said earlier that these guys can exchange gases directly through their skin. That's the cutaneous part. So we look at their circuit as systemic, just like everybody else, but they have a pulmonocutaneous circuit that goes both through their lungs and to their skin capillaries to do the gas exchange, return that oxygen-rich blood back to their body, and then send that off to the rest of their body for that systemic circuit. Reptiles have that systemic circuit. They also have the lungs, so they have a pulmonary circuit, but then they have this interesting little offshoot from the right side of their heart. And so their pulmonary circuit picks up blood here, but they also then send blood both directions. So they actually don't have a fused wall up here when we look at the tops of their ventricles. So it does allow some mixing of oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood together. All right. And that's where you're getting this sort of purple flow from. And then the mammals do have that fused, what you call your septum of your heart. So it's completely connected. So pulmonary circuit, back to the heart, systemic circuit, back to the heart, just like you're used to seeing. So if we take a little closer dive into this, right, your amphibians actually have a three-chambered heart. So they've got two atria at the top and a single ventricle at the bottom. This does end up meaning that some of that blood, just like I mentioned in those reptiles, the oxygen poor, oxygen rich, does get mixed a little bit, which does limit the efficiency of the system. But the cool thing about these guys is that pulmonary or pulmocutaneous circuit. So they'll send that blood out to their lungs, but when they're underwater, they can cut the flow of that blood to their lungs off and allow the exchange of gases to be completely through their skin, which is pretty cool. Reptiles, with the exception of birds, by the way, so keep that just in the back of your head, also have a three-chambered heart because if you look, their septum isn't incomplete. We come back here, these guys don't have a septum at all. Okay, so sort of just an idea when we're looking at evolutionary progression, these guys probably were a little earlier than the ancestors of reptiles. Don't have a completed septum, so they still get some of that gas exchange. They do also have two aortas coming out of the top of their heart, so a right and a left aorta, That right aorta tends to get a little more of the deoxygenated blood, but that doesn't mean that that left systemic aorta isn't possible of getting one as well. But then they do have a pulmonary and systemic circuit, just like we're used to seeing, because they've got lungs and then they send the blood to the rest of their body tissues through that systemic circuit. We get some mammals, and the birds are also here. Now we can see that that septum has fully formed. All right, so somewhere in that evolutionary tree, we now have that fully formed septum, two distinct aortas, as well as two distinct ventricles. So being able to keep that deoxygenated and oxygenated blood completely separate increases the efficiency even further here. So when we look at our cardiovascular system, which is what we're going to focus on from here on out, it's a vertebrate closed system, right? Meaning we've got a network of blood vessels carrying nutrients, carrying oxygen, water, carbon dioxide around your body. Your heart and your blood vessels and your blood, their whole job is to supply your body cells with the nutrients and the oxygen that they need in order to do their functions while also taking away waste products and carbon dioxide. So we carry oxygen and nutrients to your body, to those cells, and then remove the waste products all within the same system here. So something to keep in mind, especially in our body and a lot of other mammals and higher order organisms, you do have interactions between other body systems. We're going to focus mostly on us from here on out, which means we do have interactions between our respiratory system, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about when we get to the second part of this chapter. You've also got interactions with your lymphatic system, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, also plays a role in your immune system as well, because your lymph nodes are full of those white blood cells, just kind of watching and monitoring for any sort of foreign pathogens, and then also helps to return that excess tissue fluid back to circulation so that you don't swell up. All right, if we can't return that tissue fluid when it gets to be excess, then you end up with something you may have heard of as edema, and we'll come back to that a little later. But basically, you end up swelling up, all right, if your body can't keep up with that return to circulation. And then, of course, your endocrine system, which we will talk about later this year as well. So just being able to be a transport system to move hormones around your body so that your body can communicate and coordinate different functions with each other. We need a distribution system, and your circulatory system, your cardiovascular system provides that means to move those communication molecules, aka hormones, around your body.